Hello everybody and welcome back to the Costing and Pricing Learning Program. My name is David Gilchrist and today I'm presenting webinar 18. This is another Costing and Practice webinar, so practice-based webinar, where we're having a look at workforce planning. Similarly to webinar 17, where we looked at service mix, the audience for this webinar is probably most likely going to be micro, small and medium organisations. However, of course, there will be some things that would be useful to larger organisations too. As always, the copyright remains on this material, and indeed it can be used for any function, including to be used for paid presentation, but cannot be disaggregated. That is, you can't use components of this material and you can't take away the logos or the colour schemes. In terms of navigation, the previous webinar 17, was understanding service mix and service volume. Webinar 18 is related to workforce planning. Let's get into it. The learning objectives for this particular webinar focus on how you might take some of the costing and pricing learning program materials that we've looked at previously, how you might consider some of the elements around planning and forecasting what's going to happen in your organisation, and I guess extend those costing and pricing and forecasting activities to look at how you might plan your workforce and particularly, obviously, strategically respond to your expectations regarding your workforce into the future. We've already looked at costing for individual staff members in webinar 14, which gave us an idea of the costs associated with employing people and deploying them. We looked in webinar 17 at the service mix, and both of those two webinars are very relevant to today's webinar as well. You need to probably go back and have a look at webinars 14 and 17 after you've listened to this webinar and looked at the materials in order to feel comfortable with the materials that we're presenting. Workforce planning is, though, the process we use to determine what numbers of what kinds of staff we will need over a particular period. Indeed, we're interested in how many staff we require, what their qualifications might need to be and the mix of those qualifications, but also when we need them to work. So a lot of disability service organisations operate on a 24/7 basis, that is, they operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and therefore we need to get a sense of what service delivery requirements there are so that we can understand what our staff requirements might be immediately or throughout the reporting period. The webinar considers and looks at some ideas for calculating these requirements, but we also look at some of the broader strategic things to consider as well. In terms of workforce planning, of course, there's a number of elements to that. For instance, we need to know what our likely demand for services is, both in terms of mix, so types of services, and also the number of services. Therefore, that understanding the mix of services that you're strategically aiming for is really critical in the process of actually understanding what your workforce requirements are going to be. You need to understand and have a sense of the forecasting of the timing of service delivery. When do clients want services to be delivered, and when are staff available to deliver those services? Equally, there will be cost implications here, of course, because awards and arrangements for employment might make different costs attributable to different times in the working day or the working week. We also need to know the productivity of staff, that is, what are staff able to produce in a day, and probably more importantly, what are they likely to continue to produce? That is, how many units of measurement or service iterations can they deliver in a day, but more importantly, what is history telling us that they are likely to deliver in the foreseeable future? Therefore, we're not so much interested in their capacity as an organisation, but rather the likely level of supports and services we're going to actually deliver. We need to have an understanding of what our staff's required qualifications are. That is, not only how many staff we need, not only what we need them to be doing and when we need it to be done, but also what sorts of qualifications, training, professional development or other elements are required to allow these staff to be able to undertake the work that they undertake. Second last point there, staff turnover is of course critical as well, because when we're planning our workforce, we're not just planning in terms of how we deploy our workforce, but we're also planning for the context, the makeup of the workforce, and also the replacement of the workforce, depending on what our staff turnover, or if you like, our staff churn is. That is, how many people are resigning or leaving the organisation each period, and how many are joining the organisation. Again, that will have implications regarding cost. And we need to not only perhaps know what our demand for services are and our mix is currently, but we might also need to know what our planned service mix is going forward. And again, Webinar 17 helps us to understand that. Note though that we focus on averages at the organisational, divisional or product level rather than individual staff. Now this also might change depending on the size of the organisation. If it's a very small organisation, say operating in a rural or very remote environment, it might be logical to actually plan what each staff member is going to do. By and large though, most organisations have a workforce that is perhaps too large to be planning on an individual basis, and therefore we have to take into account averages of staff availability, time and the expectations placed on them. Of course, there's a few other things that we need to also give some thought to when we're talking about workforce demand forecasting. Firstly, how far into the future do you want to plan? Are you only planning for this coming budget year, or are you only planning for the coming month? Are you planning for an extended period? Of course, there's a few things around the time frame that need to be considered. Firstly, the more futuristic you become, so the more extended into the future your planning becomes, the more unlikely the planning scenario is going to come about in its full term, if you like. That is, the more forward-looking you are, the least comfort you have that what your assumptions and your planning suggests is going to come true. You also, of course, as I mentioned before, need to look at what your history is telling you about workforce needs. So it's one thing to plan in the future, but you need to look behind you to see what's actually occurred in the past in order to be able to make sure you feel reasonable about your planning outcomes. Now that doesn't mean that at the end of the day you shouldn't forecast for substantial change, but you should have the strategic plans in place, the business plans in place, and the capacity in place to be able to make the changes necessary to ensure that workforce demand outcome is actually achieved. Next, you need to think about how the coming period will be different from the historical experience. What we do, how we do it, what clients we want, where clients are, what kind of staff we need are all questions to be asked at this point. The difference between what we've done and what we want to do needs to be reconciled so that you feel that your workforce demand forecasting process is reasonable. And then you need to think about whether you're planning at a daily, weekly, monthly or even annual level. What level is rational and logical for you to plan your workforce demand, and understanding of course that the lower down the chain, so the more minute your planning is, so say at the day level, the more accurate it is, but of course the higher cost and the more complex it becomes. So the higher level we plan, the less cost involved, and we're always concerned in the Costing and Pricing Learning program about cost-benefit ratios and thinking about whether or not there's a benefit that outweighs the cost by planning more or less minutiae in your organisation, that is, planning to the lowest level. The other thing that we need to think about too is the demand profile for our services. So it's one thing for us to suggest that we might want to produce particular services or provide particular services because of the staff demand or the staff profile that we're looking to achieve. It's another thing to be able to say that those services will be able to be consumed. And so different services are required at different times, while resources may also have a profile that needs exploring, by which I mean that different services have their own demand profile. That is, the time that they need to be delivered, the way they need to be delivered, who they need to be delivered by, etc. But so too do the staff arrangements, and you need to reconcile the demand profile with the staffing profile that you have and how you might change that profile. But in short, the demand profile for each of your units of measurement or your service iterations include questions like: what days are services demanded? What times in the day are they demanded? when are staff prepared to work, because the awards don't necessarily allow you to be as flexible as you might want to be. And so a question is, how flexible are staff might be extended to how flexible are staff and the awards under which they operate. The other thing that you might need to consider is whether or not there's a seasonal impact to what you do. Now, an example that comes to mind is where organisations provide disability services in remote regions where there might be weather or cultural priorities that mean that some services are demanded all year round while others might only be demanded or indeed be able to be provided in certain seasons. The other aspect of seasonality might include Christmas holidays or other holiday periods where demand might go up or go down on a traditional basis, depending on what families or natural supports are responsibility they're taking during those periods. In considering this, you might create, for instance, a weekly table including service demand and times for each day, or you might do it on a monthly basis as well. You might also, at this point, revisit your service mix and your costing processes. This demand profile may see your cost change and your service mix change. So you need to go back to those webinars and just re-look at some of the concepts in there. Here's an example, though, of converting workload to base FTE or full-time equivalent. If we step out how many hours in the day we have staff available for, how many weeks in the year, and indeed how many annual hours, you can see those calculations on the left-hand side of the screen. We've then extrapolated those calculations to be able to forecast the number of hours of service delivery required within each month based on the number of days in those months. We've then identified the FTE by simply dividing those forecast hours by the number of hours each full-time equivalent person might work. Now, remembering a full-time equivalent person may well be made up of a number of people who work on a part-time basis. So this is just one point of, or one way of, looking at how many full-time equivalents you might need. And of course, seasonality might come into this where, for instance, if you use my example about Christmas and the Christmas break where people might not need so many services, you might actually see a dip in full-time equivalents there. Part of your workforce planning process in that case might see you requiring people to take leave in December, for instance, because the demand simply won't be there from a day-to-day basis. It's important to note, though, that in converting this workload to base FTE, this is a very simplistic calculation, and there might be times when organisations need to be a little bit more substantial in the kinds of calculations they undertake and how they approach workforce planning in that regard. There are some resources on the Costing and Pricing website, Learning Program website, that might allow you to look at some tools that help you to undertake your workforce planning. Here's another way of looking at your staffing distribution. Rather than looking at it on a daily basis and then extrapolating that to a monthly basis, which we did in the last slide, in this slide we're actually looking at one day and the demand on services between 2 years at those times in the day. And as you can see by this graph, between 9 o'clock and 6 o'clock is when most of the services are required and where staffing is required. This is a really useful graph on two counts. The first one is that it compares 1 year with another year. And that's really important because we need to come back all the time and undertake a reasonableness check by looking at the history of the organisation and how it's performed in prior years. The second element of why this is important is because it really allows you to get a sense of what the change between 1 year and the next might have been. This might not be so important initially as you're planning your workforce for the first time, but as you go on planning your workforce development, it's very interesting to perhaps plot your expectations, what your plan set out to do, and what actually occurred during the year to get a sense of both the trend and also how accurate you were from year to year. However, this graph is, I think, quite instructive because you've got some time in the day where you might be able to incentivize clients to take services to reduce the number of FTE you require, but to increase your productivity. So, for instance, if you look at the period 6 AM to 9 AM, and I'm just shooting the breeze here with ideas, but of course there are a whole lot of reasons why people prefer their services between 9 and 6 PM. However, if you had the ability to perhaps offer a discount to recipients, to service users, they might move from that 9 to 12 area where you have high demand to a lesser demand area so that you can flatten out your staff requirements during the day. Just an idea, but this is another way that we can use the planning process for workforce demand, because we can actually look at not only where the demand is, but we can start to develop some strategies to spread the demand to make the cost, utilisation and the staffing numbers requirements a little easier for your organisation to bear. There are other issues to consider, of course, and firstly, changes in requirements may see changes in targeted staff recruitment and staff turnover. These kinds of changes might see that you need to have more better trained staff, more qualified staff, but you might also see staff turnover, meaning that you have increased costs such as induction costs, increased administration costs as you process more staff and release other staff. So those things need to be considered as well. You might require new or more training at an added expense, and particularly ongoing training might be required where you're trying to increase the skills of staff. It might also be, as I mentioned before, useful to consider discounts to clients or other ways of incentivising clients to go and have their services at particular times where you're currently seeing your staff are underutilised, or have to allow them to avoid busy periods. Now that's a very, very serious strategy to consider from the point of view of the income of the organisation. So you need to be sure that any discount you offer or any incentive that you offer doesn't cost more than the relative savings that might be accrued as a result of you changing the demand patterns of your organisation. For instance, if you move demand from that central time in the day that we looked at in that previous graph to either side of the day, you might incur loadings or some other penalty as a result of having staff working less social hours than they might otherwise work. You might also have trouble because some of those staff might have children at home and might be choosing to work, for instance, during the school day so that they can be there when their children leave for school and they can be home when their children come home from school. And therefore that level of commitment or convenience may be destroyed if you upset the way these services are provided. It might be really necessary, it will be necessary to come back and always look at that cost-benefit rule, whether the cost of your processes are outweighed by the benefits of the information provided and also the strategies supported by that. And then finally, always undertake a reasonableness test. Whenever you undertake any sort of forecasting or process, you need to undertake that reasonableness test. Part of the reasonableness test, though, is always looking at the relevant range and remembering, like activity volumes, like all of the other elements that we look at in costing and pricing, the relative demand for staff is also affected by the relevant range. And remembering in webinar 4 that the relevant range is that range of activity level, that types of activity, numbers of activity, locations of activity, where our assessments and our assumptions regarding costs remain the same. If you move staff to a new time, a new day, or a new location, or you change the way you deal with staff, you may well incur more costs, and therefore any proposed saving relative to your demand requirements for staff might be swallowed up in additional costs associated with your staff employment. That concludes the webinar for today, looking at workforce planning. I hope you found it useful. Remember to go back and have a look at your webinar 17 in the mix, client mix and service mix, and also the costing and pricing webinars themselves, because at the end of the day, staffing demand is hooked in very, very closely to the cost of service delivery and how you approach it. I hope to speak to you soon in the Costing and Pricing Learning Program, but don't forget to visit the Costing and Pricing Learning Program website in order to ensure that you use the tools, or at least have a look at the tools that are made available for staff demand forecasting. Thank you very much, and talk to you soon.